Welcome to our Friday afternoon live chat. Interesting people in interesting times. And we have had a number of really interesting Friday afternoon guests from many walks of life. I am really happy and we're privileged and excited to have Dr. Harold Martin with us today to talk about civil unrest. But you may have noticed the title of this program was Civil Discourse and Civil Unrest. So we are going to hit on a lot of really touchy subjects in our society today, but we're going to do it in a civil discourse way. And I think the introduction of Dr. Martin, those of you who signed up saw his intro. He has tremendous what they call street cred in this area, and I've had the privilege of working with him on many projects over many years and watching how he navigates among different community groups, how he navigates among the minorities, and not just African American, but the lower income segments. And every time I watch him navigate very tough issues, I come away impressed. So this is a privilege to have you on, Harold. Thank you for coming today.
Dennis, thanks very much. And I'm certainly delighted to be here and share a few thoughts.
And I should mention that in the midst of the civil unrest, Harold is in the midst, and all his colleagues are in the midst of trying to prepare for opening North Carolina A&T University in the fall by dictate of the North Carolina collegiate system. And Harold, you described that the other day as one of the great challenges of your life. So just all the complexity of that. So in the midst of all that, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So start us off, Harold. What are some of your thoughts about what's going on?
Well, I've been asked a lot of questions about why now, why so much is occurring as a result of the unfortunate murder, and I'll characterize it in that way, of George Floyd. Quite honestly, why are we seeing such significant protesting of citizens all over the world, quite honestly? And from my perspective, quite honestly, and it's just not resulting from George Floyd in many, many ways. If many of us on this Zoom exchange have been paying attention over the last month and a half or so, the whole conversation around not only the murder of George Floyd, but also the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, the egregious act in that space, and how it went unresolved for about a month and a half before any real action was taken to address this man's clear murder by what anyone would characterize as a couple of racist father and son. But that fed into the unfortunate situation with police officers who then burst into with a no-knock warrant in Kentucky, where a young woman was killed, Breonna Taylor. And on the heels of that, you then had the situation in New York in the park with the young woman calling the police on the bird watcher, Cooper, also by the same name, and then prescribed the situation where he was attacking her, albeit that was simply not the case. But I think, unfortunately, the George Taylor situation was probably one of the most egregious. It was egregious from most any angle you look at the situation, where police officers who are sworn to protect and serve had George Floyd cuffed, under control, on the street, face down, with a knee in his neck and a smirk on his face, hand in his pocket, almost a cavalier-like demeanor that angered most citizens of our nation and many people around the world around this behavior. That provoked a high level of anger and saying, this is just simply unacceptable. But unfortunately, there's been this evolving conversation around police brutality in the African American community for quite some time. And death after death after death. And I decided not to bring up a whole lot of names as part of our discussion today. But I think the George Floyd matter struck a significant chord and brought out the compassion and engagement of lots of citizens to say this is simply unacceptable. And in many, many ways, all of this is just simply the last straw. And so what you're seeing is a large number of what I characterize as, in many, very young, very bright, very diverse groups of our nation's citizens who are saying they are not going to tolerate this any longer. These young people are growing up very differently, and it is in their minds that we now must take the lead in doing something different about addressing this specific problem. Now, policing is not the only issue we need to deal with, but in this instance, these protesters are saying we must have reform in police departments, quite honestly. And so there is an absolute demand that there be standard set police department reform and policy change within police departments all over America. Now, how that happens, who takes the lead in making that happen, is a very challenging conversation. But I don't think this is going to go away as protests in the past have done. Something happens, people in the African American community get angry, they step up, they protest, and then nothing really happens. And over a few months, it subsides and things go back to normal. I don't expect that's going to be the case. At least that's my hope. And I think it's not going to go back to normal because there are a broader array of citizens in our nation who recognize that there is something terribly wrong in the way we police today.
Well, and it strikes me, Harold, I've got a list here of over 100 announcements that have been made in the last week and a half alone, that as I look at this list, over half of these things were things that some of us would have said, well, that's not going to happen in our lifetime.
That's right.
So we're hitting some kind of tipping point here, for sure. So let's start with the police issue, because you've talked about that, and I know that this is a complex. There's myriad pieces of this, and you and I have been trying to over many years direct water at the base of the fire of many issues. So we'll get to those, but let's start with the police side. And on the police side, the unions seem to be blocking or resisting any change. How do you get over that element?
Well, I think the decision can't be left for the unions to make the call, quite honestly. I think very honestly, as we've observed here in Greensboro, the police chief, James, the newly appointed Greensboro Police Department chief, has been working very closely with city manager David Parrish and the city council to make adjustments in policy related to behaviors of the Greensboro police. How search warrants may be gained and how they may be administered, quite honestly, and requiring certain levels of approval before that happens, but also use of certain levels of force before a weapon is fired certain checks and balances must be clear before a weapon is drawn and used. Also, when a suspect is apprehended, what types of procedures or holds are acceptable holds or ways of securing that suspect. Chokeholds or hog ties, as they're oftentimes referred to as well, as to how a suspect is bound, can no longer be used because in too many instances where these types of actions are used, individuals have died. Eric Garner, George Floyd, the citizen here in Greensboro who was hogtied and subsequently died in Greensboro. Those types of policies are related to local municipal leaders, mayors, city council persons, for example. And these protesters are rightfully, in my mind, calling on Congress to set a standard for appropriate police conduct and protocols, quite honestly. And I think it will take the intrusion of and oversight of Congress to step into this conversation and set standards for appropriate policing across our nation. What we have found is that unfortunately policing left to the devices of various city council persons or municipal groups or mayors or political groups in a particular community leads to and is strongly influenced and protected by unions. Very little changes and behavior continues. And when you look at statistics that speak to those persons who are most likely to be arrested aggressively or where deadly force is used or hog ties or these unacceptable uses of force are permitted, they are used by individuals. And then we provide protections for police officers behind such things as I felt for my life or and et cetera. And when we have, and I would say to you, and I've said this to our students and other groups I've spoken to, I believe in our police. I believe that police officers, most are wanting to do good. They are good people, and they absolutely are sworn to protect and serve. Unfortunately, there are bad apples, and we aren't making provisions for removing the bad apples in appropriate and timely fashion. For example, Siobhan in Minneapolis, Minnesota had been disciplined a number of times, but he was still on the force, for example. In situations like that, there have to be certain levels of standard where police departments are making critically important decisions where those types of individuals are no longer on the force.
Well, so we have a audience question, and we do have a number of folks in the audience who are either current or former law enforcement,
Sure.
some in police, some in Homeland Security, in various capacities. So the question of law and order, and some of these situations are dynamic. In fact, the specific question I had here from someone that I know is a good apple in that law enforcement area is that there have been radical elements on the left and the right that have been stirring up some of the problems, generally not the protesters themselves, and that those people are so unpredictable that you have to use judgment on the scene. So the specific question is, how can we hire better for judgment? Training is part of it, but how can you hire for judgment, and then presumably, if their judgment is bad, not put them in those position to be in those roles?
Well, hiring for judgment means we have to do a better job of screening persons who are applying to be police officers. Being a police officer is a critically important civic responsibility in our communities. They really are. And they are positions of trust where we are placing significant responsibility in the hands of these individuals, quite honestly. So a much higher level of scrutiny is in order, without exception, to ensure that we are selecting appropriate individuals who bring both not only a mental capacity, but also a set of values that respects all individuals, so that they are, even in the midst of knee-jerk decisions they've got to make as a result of a fluid situation, they're making those decisions in a fair and in a positive and less judgment. It's too easy to excuse this is a fluid situation, the person had to make a decision. And when you go back and take a look at the video cam shots of situations where officers have acted as a result of a fluid situation and hadn't shot someone, and you evaluate the circumstances, the unfortunate situation is the person has lied on the arrest report and has stretched the facts and have not been as truthful about and have been self-protecting of themselves. And those are not the kinds of individuals we're looking to have on our police department, quite honestly. People make mistakes, no question, by any measure. And then training is critically important, and ensuring that officers are able to do a better job of diffusing situations, much more so than they have exhibited in the evidence that has been shown, where individuals have been quick to pull their weapons, or the officer becomes the aggressor as opposed to the suspect themselves. And so I hear this. I've had these great debates with my own police officer, my own police chief on my campus, when I believe he, as a police chief, is coming at me with responses that say that he's protecting the officers as opposed to backing away and saying, now, wait a minute, let's think this through and let's figure out whether this officer really responded appropriately because the situation dictated it, or they simply were not prepared to have, in this instance on our campus, a student speak to them that way, or a person in the community have a person of color speak to an officer in such a way that that officer takes offense, quite honestly. So there are a whole lot of factors here that play into how an officer responds, quite honestly.
So the follow-up question then from the audience is, you laid out what you think needs to happen to, I guess, override unions. Do you actually think it's going to happen?
I think this is part of legislation that may come from Congress. Yes, I'm anticipating, given that both the House and Senate now are beginning to focus conversations in this space, that they may find themselves bringing forth legislation that may have some substance and value. I also expect municipalities, mayors and city council persons and city officials are going to take even more aggressive steps in redefining ways in which they will foster conversations around better policing, more effective attracting and training and deploying police officers as parts of the police departments as well. So I do expect we're going to see some level of change, more so now than we ever have in the past.
Okay, very good. Well, and we lost your video there for
I
about 10
saw that
seconds.
actually. I've not had that as a problem before, so I don't anticipate that's going to be a problem. My network tends to be pretty stable.
Well, good. Okay. So, yeah, let's move on to how are you preparing young African Americans for the work environment around the country? You have become the number one in a whole host of categories, well beyond engineering, uh, provider of African American into the workforce. So what are some of your thoughts about what preparation goes in there, other than they need to be as smart as anybody in whatever their field is?
Sure. Well, one of the things we've been very clear about is that our university, based upon its land grant mission and its diverse category, we've had to make some really tough decisions over the last decade or so to reposition the university as one of our top, in the top 10% of our peer universities of comparable universities in America. The East Carolinas and UNC Charlotte's, the VCUs, for example, the Georgia States, the New Mexico States, comparable universities who are land grant universities or doctoral research universities. And being amongst the top tier of those universities means that we are raising the level of our academic programs, the expectations of our faculty, the profile of the students we attract into our university. And we are well beyond the 10% of that peer group. We are recruiting top students to our university. We are investing in some of America's top faculty who are joining our university to enhance and transform academic programs on our campus. And we're engaging our students in profound ways in preparing them in rigorous, demanding academic programs. But we're also exposing them to very diverse culture on our campus. We have a very diverse student population today, very diverse faculty that are helping us ensure that we're engaging our students in similar environments in which we expect our students to work when they leave our university. But we also are bringing to the university thought leaders who help our students think about how they see themselves helping to solve some of the big issues in our society: hunger, unemployment, health disparities, economic and wealth disparities in our nation, while they're also advancing their own careers, quite honestly. Because many of our students are coming from rural America, while there are a high percentage of minority students coming to our university, they still don't have the same level of experiences of cultural enrichment that we are providing for them. Opportunities to engage in global experiences in significant ways. When we are demanding our students to be exposed to these kinds of experiences, providing opportunities for them to engage in very different thought levels of discussion, they're leaving the university very different. For example, some of our students are out participating in these protests. I could assure you that the predominance of our students involved in any of these protests are in leadership roles, or they are peaceful protesters. They are looking to make a difference. They're looking to engage and improve the quality of life and change and drive change where there's a necessity in driving change in our nation as a whole, and certainly in our communities where these students are going to live and work. And so we have positioned the university in very substantial ways to be the best among its peers. And quite frankly, the data reflects that we are positioned to continue to make a difference in educating bright and talented young people in our university.
Okay, well, and so that gets us to a real hardball question here.
Okay.
So there are so many questions swirling around the civil unrest, and one of the questions is the African American issue around something you mentioned a few minutes ago, that they haven't had maybe as many opportunities or mentors at home? Or is it much more systemic back to the way they were brought to this country and held to a lower standard, essentially oppressed for even after slavery was over.
Sure.
So where's the base of the fire there?
Well, I think it would be naive for any of us to suggest that race is not a factor in defining outcomes for our nation as a whole. And in my mind, this is an American issue. This is not an African American issue, because it is my firm belief when all citizens in our nation are not made to have access to, in a similar way, without opposition and suppression, rights and privileges and opportunities for success in the same way white citizens are. We all suffer, and that's the evidence of that we see. Let me give you an example. When I grew up here in North Carolina, I grew up in Winston-Salem, and I grew up in East Winston in Winston-Salem, which is similar to East Greensboro here in Greensboro. East Winston is the African-American community, wonderful community, great citizens in that community where I went to school, I went to church, I was tutored by lots of incredibly good people. I had two wonderful parents who were very protective of my brother and sister and me, and individuals in our neighborhood were very clear about ensuring that we were aware of the importance of education and that we were preparing ourselves to go off and do well in school and succeed. The challenge is that when I go back, my parents are now passed away, but when I go back to that community where I grew up, which has been 50 years, let's say, very few municipal dollars have made their way into that community. Very few business dollars for economic growth and prosperity in that region, job creation and investments to change the narrative in that community have occurred. But when you look at where investments have been made, and so pretty much East Winston is pretty much the same as it was as 50 years ago when I left as a student going off to college. That's not dramatically different than here in Greensboro, in East Greensboro. It is amazing to me that housing and unemployment and homelessness and low wealth and limited economic development interests occur in East Greensboro when economic development and wealth creation and investments of municipal dollars and business dollars are occurring all over Greensboro and limited investments in East Greensboro. That says to me there's a problem. When I arrived as Chancellor at A&T in 2009, about 11 years ago now, it was amazing to me, and some of that's the fault of our university, I'll say that very candidly, and we have worked at changing that level of engagement of our university as an outwardly engaging, less insular, proactively building relationships with the business and industries in Greensboro and Guilford County, as an example. But the business leaders and municipal leaders in East Greensboro, many of whom had spent no time whatsoever on our campus, didn't know where we were. And to me, that says to me either that's not important and it's not key to that business leaders or the chamber or the city council or county commissioners, elected leaders understanding of the importance of when you literally leave out a fairly sizable population of your community around quality of life, wealth, job creation, and the like. That's not equity. That's not commitment to fairness and inclusion. And so you made reference to this unfortunate situation with George Floyd. And all of a sudden people were writing statements to speak to their employees, to share their passion about this is unacceptable, and et cetera. Well, why now? When you've got all of the evidence or these examples of inequity around you, and evidence that that level of inequity in our community is, business leaders should be just as concerned about the fact that individuals are not being pulled into the workforce, or there's not the same level of investments occurring in our communities. I had this big conversation, for example, with the editorial board of the newspaper. I've been very intentional about engaging in conversations with the editorial board. I spent a significant amount of time with several researchers on our campus to look at disparities in what one would characterize as East Greensboro versus outside of East Greensboro, West Greensboro, North Greensboro, et cetera, and comparing things like unemployment, value of homes, average salaries or average household incomes, and et cetera. And it is amazing the significant levels of disparity in some of these areas. But one of the areas that I found to be very interesting was the area of crime. Crime in East Greensboro was not as high as crime in other areas outside of East Greensboro. But I said to the editorial board, when you write your stories, or WFMY or GHP or XII in Winston write stories or air the news, crime in East Winston or crime in East Greensboro are much higher. And so now imagine what you're saying to business leaders. Imagine what you're saying to individuals who are professionals and are looking for a place to live. Imagine what you're saying to them about the schools and quality of life and safety. And what you're doing then is steering those individuals out of East Greensboro into other places to live, because crime, which is not true, is higher in East Greensboro than is somewhere else. And so we've had to change these narratives that are built around race and racism and perceptions, so that we begin to incrementally change these outcomes that are eroding the possibilities that others, that all in our society, all in our community, have the same opportunities to benefit in a fair and equitable way. Long answer, but my perspective, and I think it's a very a fair assessment of where I think things are, and we need to be doing a better job in Greensboro as a whole.
Great. So you and I both had the opportunity to work very closely with the late great Ralph Shelton,
Yeah.
Who was a African-American business leader here in town. And Ralph and I went on many missions together, and I was always also amazed at the way Ralph communicated to some of the young African Americans, and talking to them about make no excuses about anything.
That's right.
Make no excuses about anything. You know, your future is up to you. And I wish we had Ralph, you know, short of a seance, I guess, to be with us today, because it would be.
So do I, actually, I must say.
So what would you think? And what would you think Ralph would be saying if he were on this Zoomcast about the issues going on? What do you channel him for a second?
Well, I think that's a very fair question, and I think Ralph, as often as I had conversations with him, would have a similar perspective about the protesters, and would advise them to continue to peacefully protest because there needs to be change in our society, in our communities, quite honestly. In this instance, related to police brutality, that needs to be addressed in a fairer, more equitable way. But there are other things that are contributing to the lack of continued progress of African Americans in this instance in Greensboro. And he would say some of the same kinds of things. He mentored lots of minority businesses and business leaders in East Greensboro. He really did. He made investments and used some of his own resources to make some of that happen as well. But Ralph never bit his tongue overall. He would say things in a very polite and professional way, but he was very firm and very candid about people having to get up off their backside and take advantage of opportunities and move forward and taking advantage of the opportunities and in some ways drive themselves as well. You can't sit around and whine and complain about the way things are unless you're going to get up and go do something about it as well. And I think Ralph would speak in that vein, in that space, and would not be bashful about it.
Well, and it did strike me hard, actually, because I loved Ralph. It struck me that, his nickname was the Quiet Giant.
That's right.
And George Floyd's nickname was the Quiet Giant.
Yeah.
Kind of hit a little too close to home there. So let me ask you about what to do. So we've had a number of conversations in past weeks with the leaders of companies, some public, some private, where they are determining, okay, what action can we take here? Okay, we can say things, but anybody can say things, and to use the old cliche, talk is cheap. What's the actual action? And so there was one leader that I was talking to who has actually done an amazing job in his company, incredible job around minorities, who said, but I'm not sure a new affirmative action is the answer. So let's get into that topic. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think it's an affirmative action conversation as much as it is an acknowledgement that something is wrong, that the reason that, let me back up. Business leaders, political leaders acknowledged in this instance with George Floyd that something was terribly wrong. This was murder. This is symptomatic of something that's terribly wrong in policing, and certainly in this instance in the Minneapolis, Minnesota Police Department. But the evidence suggests that this is potentially true in other police departments around the nation as well. Now, so it's not just, so if we extrapolate this to why is there such a disparity in achievement gap in our children in public schools? And what do we do about it to address improving that achievement gap and deploy resources and some tough decisions to really address eradicating those achievement gaps? In my mind, that has to be done. And some tough decisions do have to be made. Quite honestly, we pander too much to one group or the other, as opposed to really backing away and saying that parents have to be engaged in this conversation. We have to have better teachers, and we have to deploy more resources with better technology and better school environments for children to learn, quite honestly. There's something terribly wrong when you have such a high level of unemployment in one community versus another. Why is that? We've got to be able to take each and every one of these levels of disparities where people are not achieving as they should and stop giving lip service to these things and finding reasons and ways to address them. I'll give you an example. And when you go back and start looking at racial inequities in our nation, we've been talking about this for a long, long time. There is no reason for us to continue to have to look and speak to these disparities and sweep them under the rug, as opposed to pulling them out and acknowledging that there's a problem here. And Dennis, in my mind, when we have all of us involved in these discussions, white America engaged in a similar way, partnering with all ethnic groups, and in this instance, African Americans, we solve a lot of problems. We do. And so my point here is we know these situations exist, and we've got to make every effort to commit to focus on addressing these disparities in our society. Otherwise, we'll be 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, we'll have the same levels of disparity and challenges in America as we have today.
Well, thank you, Harold, on that. I unfortunately lost my Zoom connection, but I'm back.
Yeah. I saw that you were gone, but I decided I better continue to talk, and I saw you'd come back and be with us again. So,
no, I appreciate that. Okay, so let's move on because we have a number of questions.
Okay.
So the issue of companies just now leaning into some of this as a result of the moment. And there's just been a whole host this week of like big tech companies, and Silicon Valley for years has been criticized for the fact that it's been criticized on the female front, that it's been more of a male-centric, and it became sort of the center of a whole bunch of Me Too stuff. And then other ethnic minorities, other than Asians and Indians, very difficult for them to find great people to be able to hire. And so big initiatives were announced this week. In a couple of cases, huge initiatives were announced by those very entities. You're trying to prepare young people for jobs in technology.
That's right.
How many of them actually end up at a Google or an Apple or a Facebook or any of those tech companies? And what kind of challenges, is it an issue that isn't really being addressed of getting into those entities?
Great question. Let me answer it from a different perspective. You asked how many of our graduates are making their way into Silicon Valley based companies. So my quick answer is, and then I move to a different way of addressing this, a record number of our graduates are making their way into Google, Facebook, Intel, Microsoft, in huge numbers. Now, why is that happening? 10 years ago, a Microsoft or an Intel or Google or Facebook, in particular, Facebook and Google and Amazon, for example, never set foot on our campus. Today, they are on our campus on a regular basis. They are engaging and building partnerships with our College of Engineering and College of Business, College of Science and Technology, and quite frankly, with our College of Liberal Arts, because they need lots of marketing, communications, and liberal arts folk as well. And so these relationships are growing astronomically for our university. Our corporate partners for our university have more than tripled in the last 7-8 years, many of them coming out of Silicon Valley. That's a big deal for us as a university. And that in turn is driving their investments in our university. Those investments are in turn used to recruit endowed professors and highly regarded, hard to recruit faculty to our university, and our strategic investments in our academic programs, in technology and resources. But they also are allowing us to go out and recruit to our university some of the brightest students to our university in the history of our institution. You bring together that level of talented faculty and technology and learning environment, incredibly bright students. The graduates of our university are just remarkably well prepared. And that in turn drives more of them to that marketplace, making them incredibly more marketable. And so that's the kind of relationship building, partnership building that we are benefiting from today that's driving the success of our university. Now, the problem with that, Dennis, is that we've also made a commitment to work with local industries as well. And a high percentage of the local industries are tech-based, looking for STEM graduates as well. And so those local industries are now competing with those national organizations that are coming into North Carolina, to our university, as well as NC State, and recruiting large numbers of our brightest students, quite honestly. And so what we're having to do is continue to build. We're building bigger, larger staff of professionals on our teams who are helping us go out and connect with in a much more proactive way and build relationships not only with Silicon Valley and other industries and agencies around the nation, but also building stronger relationships with local and regional industries as well. Because we want to ensure that we are directing a greater percentage of those graduates into the local markets as well. It's a great problem to have, but it certainly is exciting to see such a high percentage among universities, and especially helping to drive diversity in Silicon Valley. We're one of the leading institutions that are helping to drive African-American student diversity in the tech realm in Silicon Valley.
So it sounds like that was happening well before this whole situation we have right now. Okay, so maybe there has been sincerity in this.
There has been, but we've had to again get out of Greensboro, go to Silicon Valley, build relationships, work through the corporate leadership in those organizations, and we've had to respond. We've had to deliver quality graduates year over year that allows us to suggest to those corporate partners that they can depend on us delivering year over year, and those corporate entities as partners are building into their framework expectations that they are expecting to get increasingly larger numbers of our graduates. So again, it drives us to a different place, creates significant opportunities for us. But again, as I was suggesting, it causes us some level of consternation because we also want to make sure we're delivering to the local market as well.
Well, and so I have a comment here from a member of our audience who works in the tech corridor at MIT in the Boston area,
Yes.
who wanted to remind me that everything wasn't Silicon Valley, and that you should visit there more often.
Exactly.
All of which doesn't solve the local issue. So that is yet another. I mean, it is remarkable. I've had conversations this week with leaders in a whole variety of areas who said, we have a lot of issues going on today that go well beyond COVID. And so I think you've identified that there's complexity in any of this.
Well, I think I talked about East Greensboro a few months ago, and one of the things I don't want to do is lay blame at someone else when we don't also introspectively evaluate the role we've played or not played in being an economic driver for Greensboro, Guilford County, Piedmont Triad region as a whole, when we've not done our part in East Greensboro as well. So we have been incredibly busy building and investing in our university, new facilities to accommodate growth, attracting new faculty. We're one of the fastest growing employers in this region, in Greensboro and Guilford County as well, because of our growth and hiring new faculty and hiring new staff. But we also want them to live in East Greensboro. We also want to deliver on creating opportunities for retail in East Greensboro, restaurants and support services, because if we aren't selfishly driving those kinds of investments in East Greensboro, it will hamper our ability to continue to grow our business as well, because the faculty and staff, we're hiring 60 or 70 new faculty and staff every year for the last 5 years, 70 to 100 new people a year. That's a big deal. And we want them to have quality housing and access to retail, quite honestly, and feel safe living in East Greensboro. But we need developers who are coming in East Greensboro to make provisions for those opportunities as well. So we're going to do our part, but we also need partners, the city and developers, to assist us in that space as well. And so we've created a foundation, a real estate foundation. My phone is picking up on my voice and trying to place a call for me. But my point is, we are realizing that we have to be a thought leader, driver for economic growth and prosperity in Greensboro as a whole, East Greensboro in particular. And so we're looking for partners as well. And our real estate foundation is helping us drive, creating opportunities to accommodate the restaurants and places like Starbucks and Chick-fil-A and all those kinds of spaces that didn't exist in East Greensboro, and driving affordable housing in East Greensboro, because those things are needed. And we have to continue to track the kind of work that we're doing that's truly going to make a difference in our community. One step at a time, one brick at a time, one building at a time, and one partner at a time. And we're making progress and seeing that beginning to start taking shape, which I'm very pleased about.
Well, let's get back to one of the issues. I know what you call the apex issue is the police brutality issue and getting reform going there. But the bigger, broader issue around racism in general, and not just Black versus white, it has become way more complicated than Black versus white as well. So, there's many people who are leaders of companies who are watching this, or people who don't lead companies, but are just thinking to themselves, well, what can I do? How can I get engaged? And leaders of companies are thinking, what do I need to do beyond things I've done in the past? I mean, what are some of your thoughts around all of that?
Well, it's interesting that I serve on several corporate boards, and each of the CEOs of those organizations did write a statement and send it out, sharing and reflecting on our values first reflecting on the egregious act of the police officer murdering George Floyd, et cetera, acknowledging, and I think it's critically important that people are recognizing and acknowledging the fact that that was an egregious act, there was murder, and obviously that'll have to play out in the courts. But I think the other part of this, and one of the CEOs and I had a very, very lengthy conversation about this, quite honestly, because he was struggling trying to share what he wanted to say to, I would define our company since I'm a member of the board. But what I shared with him as we talked through this, I said, either you believe this was an egregious act or you don't. And if you don't, that's saying something about potentially you. And if you share that as a perspective with your employees, I don't care what their ethnicity is, that will be damaging to you. So you're going to have to reflect on what you really believe and think about that act. I think you're also going to have to reflect very critically on what are your organization's values? What are our organization's values? Are there substantive values that really reflect you as the CEO, us as the board, and we are living those core values of engagement and fairness and equity, and all of our employees, or the predominance of our employees, believe that this organization values all of its employees, irrespective of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, et cetera, quite honestly. And that has to be reflected in the way you carry yourself and how you engage and communicate and the people you're building on your team. And when there are exceptions to those values, you are swift to take action. The evidence is true. And then there's evidence that you are ensuring that there are high levels of conversation and training around how you build teams and recruit talent to the organization. And there's evidence that you're committed to building a diverse team. You know, and on the boards where I serve, I try to be thoughtfully engaged in these conversations, but in a provocative way. I said, well, don't say that if you don't mean it, kind of conversation. And I see far too many CEOs and corporate executives say a lot of things they really don't mean. And they aren't driving a conversation that says, I want a workforce that reflects the community in which we do business. And I want evidence that we're going to make that happen. And I want to see evidence that the diverse workforce that we are building, individuals across the workforce have equal opportunity to advance within this organization. And there's evidence in my leadership team that also reflects that diversity that I'm trying to build within this organization. It's easy to talk, Dennis. When you look at my workforce, we have values that reflect our commitment to diversity and inclusion and et cetera. And it's interesting, people say, well, we're an HBCU, we're supposed to be thus and so and et cetera. I said, no, we're a business. And we are committed to diversity and inclusion like any other organization and institutions that we are competing with. And we evaluate our peers based upon their alignment with our values as well. And if you look at my leadership team, it reflects those values and the diversity we're seeking to commit to and create. Does that bring criticism of me? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's the price I pay as leader of our university that also values diversity we're committed to. I grew up as a student athlete, a fairly decent student athlete. And one of the things my coach used to drill into all of us is talk was cheap. And if we couldn't deliver on the playing field, all we're doing was talking. And so he drilled in us to reflect our actions to be consistent with our words. And I've always said that to my leadership team. We're going to be consistent with what we say. Our actions will be consistent with those. And I'll live with the criticism when we are living again, and I say that to the CEOs of the boards that I serve on, and I share it with you, that what are we going to do differently? Well, it's one thing to say these things, but it's one thing to also back away and do a self-assessment of the organization. What are our values? And are we living consistent with those values? Bringing this back to the comments that I was sharing with the CEO, who was now trying to write his statement, he backed away and developed a really, really quality statement with some input from me that reflected our company, our values, and the employees of the organization with a high level of empathy, but a high level of value and commitment that was very evident, that drew high praise from employees in the organization. And that's precisely where he wanted to be, and I needed him to be too, as a member of the board. And so I don't know what else to say in that regard, quite frankly. And so,
so what about the citizens who are not leading companies, not in maybe even in a role to influence things within whatever their organization is, or they could even be retired, who really are trying to figure out ways they can lean in? What are options?
well, very honestly, I was talking with, quite frankly, around the golf very recently, actually, with several individuals who are, one was a retired senior executive of one of our local industries. We were having this exact same conversation as well. I said, well, you can continue to sit at home and remain comfortable with folk at the club and only position yourself to volunteer in safe spaces, and or you can step out and seek to volunteer in organizations that are less white, that are much more diverse, that are much more targeted to areas where there are significant levels of disparity, and you have skills and talents where you can add value to that organization, both with your time, your talent, and occasional treasure to help that organization make a difference in the space where they are to improve disparities, quite honestly. And so sometimes we volunteer in safe spaces. And in my message to him was, stop volunteering in such safe spaces, quite honestly, where you aren't really being challenged outside of your own comfort to try to make a difference, quite honestly. And so, and I try to avoid doing that personally, quite honestly. And so if I can't give time to it and see that it's going to be a difference that I can make, I ultimately don't participate. I don't give my time to that space. And so I think we have an opportunity at this moment where individuals are wanting to be involved and be engaged. And it's my suggestion, quite frankly, is that we find those things where we know there are disparities, very clear evidence of disparities in our schools. Children are not performing at the level they should be performing by any measure. We ought to be doing something to make a difference in that space. Quite honestly, we have a number of minority businesses in Greensboro that need advice and counsel, mentors like the Ralph Sheltons that we talk about. How to direct them to opportunities where there are resources, and make decisions about how they may survive, how they may and should have gained access to some of the CARES Act funds to apply for those dollars and gain access to those dollars. In some of the instances, the paperwork necessary to complete to gain access to the loans that they needed to keep their business afloat were much more complex than they were able to do. And so gaining access to a resource that allowed them to be able to do that would have been very helpful, for example. So there are lots of possibilities in it, and not all of these are going to have immediate solutions and progress. Some of these are going to have to require some longer-term sustained investments of time and resources to begin to see results, quite honestly. And I think we're going to have to be committed. We didn't get to this space overnight, in my mind, and we're going to have to work our way out of some of these situations where disparities have been long, lingering disparities, quite honestly.
Well, in our own company, as you know, we have been leaning into inner city schools, and we really upped our game last year.
Very
and
good.
we've been having very thoughtful conversations within our firm about, okay, do we do more of that, or more schools, or do we go deeper? And one of our folks on our leadership team said, well, wait a minute, we do some mentoring, but couldn't we step up the ongoing mentoring? And so we had a record number of our employees last year that were trained with junior achievement to go into the inner city school. It wasn't just African Americans, it was poor and working poor on a whole variety of fronts. And we had a great time, but we were engaging for a short period of time. And is that really going to make a difference? So again, maybe that's part of the issue here is, we can talk about swooping in and time, talents, and treasure,
Sure.
but let's not just swoop.
Well, I think that's part of the challenge. My wife and I were blessed, and we poured energy and time and resources into these boys. We were like many parents, and not most parents, but in particular, we were like many African American parents who were determined not to let society typecast our boys, teachers put them in a corner and let them be passively ignored or under-realize their abilities and their talents, quite honestly. And fortunately, they did not, by any measure. But what I found was that this is hard work, and we have to do more to make sure that we are recognizing at a much earlier age, working with teachers and parents and these children to help build their confidence and their skills in the subjects that are going to matter in significant ways. Their ability to read, reason, and have good math skills so that they can build on those as they move through first through third grade, so that as they continue to add on levels of school, that they are better prepared to take on and navigate and be successful in subjects in high school that are going to prepare them to have choices when they finish high school. And that's a tough conversation. It really is, quite honestly. And I spend enormous amounts of my time in conversation with Sharon Contreras as superintendent and her team, but also with the two high schools we have on our campus that we make investments in. We make to be the very best high schools they can be, because they are making a difference. They really are, and graduating really, really top kids who are going off to college. But we also are ensuring that we are building the very strong college of education faculty that prepares top teachers in our College of Education. And we've got a fabulous new dean that will be joining us here in a couple of weeks, July 1st, who will help us do even more work in this space, quite honestly. So there's so much that needs to be done, especially in the space of the educational gap, quite honestly. And collaborations in this space are going to make a huge, huge difference, quite honestly. And so I applaud you and your team for the work you're doing in that space, but it cannot be a short-term investment. It's going to be, has to be a sustained level of engagement so that we can clearly see the evidence that end of grade performance is improving and the gap is shrinking, quite honestly, for these low-income kids, for these minority kids, for example, in these schools, because it's going to make a difference, not only for them and their families, but also for our society as a whole, because the better prepared these kids are going to be, the more able they're going to be successful in high school and the choices they have when they graduate from high school, and quite honestly, the better citizens they're going to be ultimately when they either go off to college, finish school, and have families of their own. And so I look at the long-term perspective and what that means in that space. And so, so I applaud the work you're doing, quite honestly.
Well, appreciate that, Harold. I guess we feel like we've just done a drop in the bucket. And I mean, one of the things we talked about is the ability to use our pretty powerful network of folks and try to recruit, 24 other entities who can train up their employees, and let's tackle every single low-income school in Guilford County. And so I don't know if we'll be able to do that in 2021, but we want to continue moving in the right direction.
I would agree.
So we have talked about a lot on the Zoomcast. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
Closing comments you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I think this is a critical time in our nation for a variety of reasons. The impact of COVID-19, the unfortunate impact of the police brutality as exhibited in Minneapolis, Minnesota, unfortunate death of George Floyd. I also think it's a critical time in our nation in a political way relative to the elections that are coming up as well. And so we've got to get people much more involved in, for all the right reasons, engagement in these big topics that are going to influence our nation as a whole as we move forward in the future. And so people are going to have to back away and ensure that race becomes less and less of why we think it's important for us to be involved and engaged, and why we demonstrate a higher level of respect for one another and support one another in making a difference and improving the quality of life for all citizens in our nation as a whole. I'll give you an example, an interesting example. My wife and I live in our private home in Summerfield, but our university residence for the Chancellor is in Irving Park. My wife and I have been living and spending time in Summerfield in our private home, and my wife loves to get out and walk, and so I expect we'll be walking in our neighborhood this evening. But almost everybody in our neighborhood is walking. And most of our neighbors are out walking today. And it is amazing to me how we've all acknowledged as a very diverse neighborhood that this is fortuitous that we are finding ourselves out walking in our neighborhood first so we get to know each other. And we're engaging in conversations that we have, in a number of years we've been here, have not engaged in. And we are realizing the value and the joy of getting to know our neighbors who are different, who look different in our neighborhood, and how much more enjoyable we're finding, and they are finding, this neighborhood to be. And I extrapolate that to suggest that that's probably true here in Greensboro. The more we get out and recognize that we're more alike than we're different, and engage more strategically in this community to get to know people we don't know, and stop judging each other by the color of our skin or our religion, our ethnicity, for example, and get to know people for who they are, how much more valuable and enjoyable living in this community, living in this city, and how much more we are apt to want to help each other and aid in making a difference in our community, quite honestly, in my mind, and see disparities be addressed and people willingly wanting to make a difference in more so. And that would be, I'm trying to not make that Pollyannish, if you will. But I really do believe that's critically important for what I see coming out of the conversations we're beginning to engage in today. Protest notwithstanding, a level of conversation and understanding that should come out of these discussions today.
Thank you, Harold. And one of our audience members made the comment that you are part of the reason building to this tipping point, but you're part of the just ongoing reason, one of the great leaders in this area to move us beyond the race area. And so, but I think there was an element in this comment around the fact that, just like you said, it's not going to happen overnight as much as all of us wish it would, that we could get beyond these conversations and get to a whole bunch of other really important issues we have to deal with, some of which you touched on today in the Zoomcast. So thank you very much for your time. We all appreciate it. And maybe we ought to be checking in with you more frequently in the future and just seeing what kind of progress we're really making.
My regard for you, Dennis, say that for all to hear, I'd make the time to engage in the conversation anytime.
All right, thank you very much. And so a reminder to our audience that this and all of our Zoomcasts have been recorded. And so you'll be able to pick that up on our YouTube channel. And we are going to continue to lean into the future of a variety of things, the Internet of Things, future of work, and future of healthcare. Many of you said we need to go back to that and do more of that as well. And so we will continue to do that. We just won't be doing it on a weekly basis. We'll now be going to an every 2-week basis. But keep those cards and letters coming on topics that you want to hear about. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. Same to you.